guys have some more questions or, yeah.
How many of them got to see the French fire?
So I was working on this for years and years, not because it actually took years and years to finish, but because I had a day job and I was just kind of, working on it as I had time. So I finished like a rough cut in 2012, and I had a screening for Ethel and Ramona and their families at the Lincoln Theater, which I don't know if you all know is like a historic African American theater on the near east side of Columbus. So they got to see it, and they were very, very sweet and supportive. They were like, "Thank you for getting our story out there." Ethel actually passed away in September of last year. Ramona is still alive and well. The Ohio History Connection, which is the History Center for Ohio, they actually have this big sports exhibit, and they interviewed Ramona, and they have some of her memorabilia in their archives now. But unfortunately, a lot of the women, who were their peers, have either passed away or they've moved away. Actually, when I had the premiere at the Wexner Center last year, this lady named Kathleen Wembley, who was also a wrestler, she called me and was like, "I heard about your documentary. I know you finished it already, but I'd like to tell you my story." And she ended up marrying a famous wrestler named Bobo Brazil, and they have a son. So there's like chapters and chapters. This could be like a mini series. This is just like a small portion of the history of these women. And I'll share something else with you. So when a lot of people, they assume that the reason I made this documentary is because like I'm some kind of wrestling fanatic. Not only am I not a wrestling fanatic, I'm not a sports fan per se at all. I am like the most unlikely person to make a sports documentary. I was the kid who was like always picked last, in recess, always uncoordinated. I remember one time in high school gym class, I ran the wrong way on the basketball court and got hit in the head with the basketball. So people think, you're a tall black male, you must be really athletic and really into sports. No, not at all. So I was sort of into wrestling when I was in middle school. That was back in the 80s when the original incarnation of the WWE was popular, and Roddy Piper and Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan were popular. So I used to watch that on cable TV, and I was kind of into it. Then when I got to high school, I kind of outgrew it. So, as an adult, I was not into wrestling at all. I'll watch the Buckeyes every now and then just because I went to Ohio State, but I'm not like a sports fan at all. So when my friend Terry Anderson called me about this story, I just thought it was interesting from the historical angle. I wasn't into the wrestling aspect of it at all. So I realized, when I finished the cut of this in 2017, when I finished editing it, I was like, you know what? I've never actually been to a wrestling match. I realized that all these years I was working on this wrestling documentary, I had never seen a wrestling match in person. So there's this big wrestling event in Orlando called WrestleCon every spring. So I went down to WrestleCon that April in 2017 because they had a big women's tournament. And I think it was good that I wasn't a wrestling fan because I was able to be objective. Sometimes when you're so close to something, it's like you can't really, kind of see the forest for the trees. So what really, really made an impression on me was at this big women's wrestling tournament, most of the fans in the audience who seemed into it were men. It seemed like the men had kind of dragged their wives and girlfriends to this, and the women were kind of sitting there looking bored. And the men, were just going crazy, not because they were looking at the women necessarily as sex objects, but they were like, into these women as like some men root for football players or whatever. And they were, after each match, they were running up to the women and taking selfies and high-fiving. And I actually interviewed some of the men afterward, and I was like, well, why would you want to come and watch women's wrestling? And they were like, oh, these women are awesome, they're really underrated. They just went on and on and on singing these women's praises. And to me, professional wrestling is kind of looked down on as like this, lowbrow. It's, quote unquote fake. Everything is choreographed. It's looked at as like this, lowbrow entertainment that's not real sports. But I actually think there's no other sporting, whatever you want to call it, sport form of entertainment where men would root for women like that. I can't imagine going to a women's football game, if such a thing existed, and seeing a stadium full of men rooting for the women and running down and wanting to take pictures with them. I can't imagine, when the WNBA was really popular, all the stands being filled with men and the men wanting to like take selfies and stuff with the women afterwards. So one thing that I think is kind of underrated about wrestling is that now these men the wrestling fans would never call themselves feminists, but they sort of have this egalitarian view of the sport of like, if you can wrestle, I'll give you respect. And I can't really think of any other sport that's like that.